Hello and welcome. I'm excited to have you join me tonight. My guest is Mark Seeley, and I'm sure many of you have followed Mark on Almanac and NPR. He's a climatologist, a meteorologist. He recently retired from the Extension Department's Department of Soil, Water, and Climate Change. And he, as you were telling me, were there for 40 years, or almost 40.
Right.
So that's a long...
It flew by. It flew by, as it often does. Many challenges, Mary, but I was there from the mid-70s until 2018 and saw a lot of changes and the need for a lot more climate education and climate change education, which still continues to grow. There's still a big need for that out there.
Yes, and more interest, as we were saying. The neat thing about your job at the U is that they really encouraged you to do a lot of public speaking and interfacing with the public, didn't they?
Right, and I think that became more emphasized over time. You know, the traditional, in the 70s and 80s, even the early 90s, the traditional mode was that you would go and have meetings. Maybe you'd have a farm meeting in Lyon County one week, and maybe you'd have a meeting with the energy sector in Otter Tail County another week, or maybe you'd have a transportation educational meeting in Rochester. But then starting in the 90s, we started to deploy all this technology, you know, where you can webcast a program or use the internet and start writing what we call blogs, information blogs or educational blogs and newsletters, or podcasts. Podcasts are becoming a very popular to deliver educational information all over the state, because as you know, University of Minnesota Extension has a mandate to cover all 87 counties. Right,
and you said you'd been in all of them, in most towns and villages and cities in the state.
Right.
As we go through the interview, I've picked out some fun facts that I've learned from Mark and from a couple of his books, and I want to just tell you what the questions are, and you can listen to see if you pick this up, and if we don't cover them in the interview, we'll be sure to include the answers at the end of the 30 minutes here. But a few of the things I want to find out from him, or we'll learn as you and me, the average number of tornadoes in Minnesota each year, what percentage of our state is forested, where are we in terms of the United States in terms of acres of wetlands, and what city in our state had the highest registered heat index in the whole United States to date. So we'll see if you can pick those up as we go. Well, I want to go back to your early days after you got your PhD.
Yes.
You ended up at the Johnson NASA Space Center in Houston. How did that happen?
Well, as is so often the case, many people finish their doctoral programs, of course, at any time of the year. I happened to finish mine in the autumn. And of course, we put applications out. You seek employment right away, because usually, especially even more so today, where you have a lot of student debt accumulated. Right. I had accumulated a student debt of $800, which sounds absurd in today's environment. But they had a job opening at the time. I didn't know too much of what I was going to be doing, but I was involved in an agricultural project with NASA, whereby we used satellite information, satellite detection technology, along with the World Weather Network, to assess production potential in agriculture for our trade partners. And what we do is we would assess all that information on a monthly basis, and then we'd give a briefing to our USDA so that the USDA could anticipate where were the needs for certain crops. Were we going to be trading more soybeans here and more corn here or more wheat here or things like that? And so it was a real interesting job, But being with NASA, being with the government, and being a certain confidentiality dimension to it, we couldn't talk about it. So, you know what I mean? We would go through and do our analysis and do our briefings and stuff, but they were very private briefings. And we worked with some special models at the time, numerical models that were used to project what the crop yields might be in various regions of the world and things like that. So it was kind of an intriguing job, and I got to use some of the tools I had learned when I was a PhD student. But it was also a little bit, what am I trying to say, limiting in terms of, I like to interact with people, with the public.
So you were
but
sequestered a bit, weren't you?
Yeah, I wasn't really able to do much of that.
So you moved from there after only a year back to, or not back to, but you came to Minnesota.
Right. The drought in 1976 was so devastating to Minnesota's agricultural economy that through some lobbying efforts of the College of Agriculture at the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota legislature prioritized and funded a position for a climate scientist to come to Minnesota. And at the time, they were looking around, and my former advisor at Nebraska in my graduate student days had recommended they come and fetch me. So anyway, they invited me to come up here. The first time I was up to my neck in work, and I politely declined. But the second time I could see I was wrapping up my work and I was going to be in a transition, so I thought, well, what the heck? So I came up for an interview and then came up, and I've been here ever since. And it was a nice job change because it allowed me to work more as an educator, not only with students but also with the general public in Minnesota, which turned out to be, if you will, the kind of career that best suited me anyway.
Yeah, just a match.
Right, right.
You said in your book, and the name of the book, and we'll show you at the end of the half hour, is the Minnesota Weather Almanac. But I read in there that you said Minnesotans are more intrigued and focused on weather than almost anyone you've known in other states or any population.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
That's interesting.
We are right in the middle, almost smack dab in the middle of the North American continent. And as a result of that, Mary, we get weather systems from all directions. We get almost what arguably is the widest variety of weather of any piece of real estate in the U.S., and we have to pay attention to it because it affects almost all aspects of our lifestyle. So over a couple of hundred years or so, or at least 150 years, we've nurtured a culture here that is really hypersensitive to the weather. It's my experience that that's the first thing everybody talks about over the cup of coffee in the morning, is the first thing they want to know is what's going on with the weather.
Or even in passing, how are you doing? What do you think of this, you know?
Right, exactly.
Rain or this drought or whatever.
Exactly,
right?
yeah, it's real common ground for us.
It is, and
yeah.
As you said, Minnesota nice, it kind of fits into the, you know, let's be friendly to our neighbors approach.
Right, absolutely.
You wrote about the effect of urbanization on climate.
Yes.
And I thought we don't have time to go into that in great detail, but that was something I hadn't thought a lot about. But just tell us some of the key effects from our major metro areas and what that does in terms of climate change.
Well, there's many. There's too many to talk about, but there's two primary ones.
Two biggies.
The one biggie that's written and researched about quite a bit is the urban heat island effect. So when we build a lot of structures on the landscape, the materials we use and how compact we tend to build things, we trap a lot of energy. And a lot of that heat energy, a lot of that solar energy that we collect during the day is stored in those structures. And so we have a temperature effect that's very measurable. So the urban heat island, even in towns in Minnesota as small as a population of, say, 40 or 50,000 people, can still have a structural dimension to them that is so concentrated there can be kind of an urban heat island there. And especially in the wintertime we notice this, where the temperature, especially the overnight temperature, is maintained at a higher level than it is on the outskirts and things like that.
So we can plant our flowers and vegetables earlier than
Absolutely.
someone out in
It
the
lengthens
hinterlands.
the growing season. Right, all those urban areas have a longer growing season than the surrounding areas. The second primary effect is in the built environment that we have in those urban areas, we generate a lot more runoff. You know, because we have a lot of impermeable surfaces.
Right,
and so when we get a heavy rain or we get a constant rain over 2 days or something like that, we generate a tremendous volume of runoff, much more than what would have been there before all those structures were built.
Sure.
And so in those two areas, those are probably two of the most researched areas relative to an understanding of the structured environment and what it can do to our climate.
Then also along with that and with the trapped heat must be then increased pollution. So our air quality.
You can have an air quality dimension.
Worse.
In fact, our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Air Quality Division has been researching that for many years for us. And unfortunately, we are going through a period where it seems like we have an air quality alert more frequently than we used to have a long time ago.
And other things have changed pretty dramatically in the last, even since 2000. The number of days that we have that are over 90 mark. Tell us some about some of the statistics that excite you and interest us.
Yeah, what's going on with our temperature is indeed our temperatures are going up in all seasons of the year. Decade by decade, as we step through time, our temperatures are warming. They're warming more so in the winter than they are the other seasons of the year, but they're nevertheless upward in all seasons of the year. And the other thing that's hand in glove with that's really important, back to this heat question and the fact that we suffer from heat stress more frequently than we used to, is dovetailing with that is we're having more frequent episodes of these high dew point days, where the dew point, and by the way, for the viewers of this program, that's the temperature at which the water vapor in the atmosphere condenses out and turns into liquid or condenses. When the rails on your stairway get wet, or the pavement outside gets wet from condensation,
or your papers on your desk get limp feeling
so the combination of the higher water vapor content and the temperature, like a 90-degree day or a 95-degree day, gives us a heat index of 110 or 115, and all of a sudden the National Weather Service is issuing an excessive heat warning or a heat advisory or something like that. And we're certainly seeing those with a lot more frequency than we used to.
What do you think is the average for numbers of days that we've got warnings out in the last few years? Is there a rough estimate?
Yeah, that's a tough one to guess. I would say at least 5 or 6 days, whereas we might go several years in between having any. You know what I mean? So it's not so much like a linear trend kind of a thing, but many Minnesota citizens could remember probably going through the decades of the 60s, the 70s, et cetera, and maybe there'd be a summer or two in the whole decade that you might have a heat advisory or an excessive heat warning out. But now they're coming almost every summer. Now they shift around a little bit. Sometimes they come in June, sometimes July or August. Last year, for example, in 2018, though, this was a bit of a surprise. Our hottest day of the year was over Memorial Weekend on May 28th.
Was it? I don't remember that.
Now, who would guess that?
Yeah, that's an anomaly, kind of.
Yeah.
And with that, though, with the high dew point, it's hard on people's health.
It is.
I mean, especially people that are older or people that are really, really young, babies.
Right, right. Well, we've learned, and I've learned this from the Mayo Clinic as well as from some of the other healthcare providers in the state, is we have segments of our population in Minnesota that are hypersensitive to this parameter of heat. You know, when the heat index gets above 90, for example, people who have multiple sclerosis feel the stress first.
Oh, really?
Or people that have chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, or what they call COPD, they feel the stress from that first. So we do have segments of our Minnesota population that have been feeling that even more than the normally healthy people have.
Asthma, kids or
Exactly.
adults with asthma.
Right, right.
Along with rising temperatures, we have rising precipitation or
Absolutely.
increased. And we're taping this, I should mention, on April 15th of 2019. We just came out of a winter that was one to really talk about and analyze in terms of amount of snow and cold. But
yeah, we just had roughly 77 inches of snow for the snow season, most of which came in the second half of winter. Yeah,
and didn't that put us in the top 5 for amount of snow in terms of years going way back?
Well, in the Twin Cities here, it put us in the top, not quite the top 10 going back to about 1880, but it put us up there. What really has been a surprise, though, recently is how frequently we've been getting the heavy load of snow in the second half of winter.
Oh, and that's a pattern you're seeing?
Yeah, that's a pattern we're seeing. So February, March, and April are tending to be more loaded with snow. Like this last February, we got 39 inches here in the Twin Cities, but we had many outstate areas of Minnesota get over 40 inches in February, which is almost totally unheard of historically.
So that's maybe my top 5.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of February.
I'm thinking of just one month. That's
exactly.
right.
Yeah.
When we think about climate change, and you've thought about it for years, a lot of people are just kind of coming on board. What worries you the most in terms of life in Minnesota?
I don't know that I could say what worries me the most. I mean, there are a number of things I'm distressed about. In the public health arena, one symptom of climate change, and this is widely acknowledged, is our mold and allergy season is much more expanded over what it was historically. Now in Minnesota, it's not uncommon that we have mold and allergy season extend right through, sometimes all the way through November into December. You know, so, and I think our healthcare providers have kind of geared up for this, you know, to treat people well deep into the autumn season, sometimes even into the winter season because of that. We also have, as you and I just talked about, more heat stress events, not only heat stress on human physiology, but I might add we've had some devastating years for the Minnesota livestock producers, either the dairy industry, the swine, or the turkey industry. We've had some really bad spells because of high heat in the summer.
And bad for our trees.
And bad for, and stress on our trees, exactly. In managing our water, now all of a sudden, we've always valued our water. We're the land of whatever, it's 11,800 lakes or something like that. But now, with the intense precipitation events we've been having, shoreline management is all of a sudden, you know, because you don't want too much runoff and all the chemical compounds that runoff has. You don't want too much flushing into the lake all at once, or into the drainage ditch and down to the Mississippi or the Minnesota or the St. Croix or what have you. And so we're having to pay a lot more attention to managing our watersheds and our lakeshore property better than we have had to do in the past. And then the last one, which is really hard to pinpoint at this point in time, but I think it's going to become a bigger concern in the future, is the threats from invasive species. Because as our climate changes, it's going to continue to provide environmental niches for certain organisms that haven't been able to live here. Some may be aquatic in nature. They may live in our lakes and streams. Some may be terrestrial in nature, and they may live on our plants, or they may be, say, new insect infestations.
The ash borer
exactly,
that kind of thing.
Or plant diseases, or things like that. For example, in the agricultural sector of Minnesota, they've been terribly worried for years about Asian soybean rust, which is a disease of soybeans, mostly been confined to the southern U.S., but it's slowly been migrating north. And so they've been worrying about, well, what if it gets to Minnesota? You know, what would we do?
Yeah,
and
our
how would
whole
we mitigate
economy
it?
could be
Right,
changed.
right.
There was a big article in City Pages about 2 months ago now, and that got me really wanting to pull you in. But it said that Minnesota might end up looking more like Kansas in terms of our ecology and our, you know, environment in 40 or 50 years. And that was a really startling.
Yeah,
I'm not
I should say, and my friends and colleagues at the U know this about me, I'm not exactly a big believer in the geographic analogy in terms of digesting the climate change message. Yes, our temperature behaviors may be analogous to what's going on in Kansas City in a few decades.
Right.
Or maybe the thunderstorm and the frequency of severe thunderstorms and things of that nature.
Tornadoes.
But we've got, as we said earlier, we've got 11,800 lakes here. I mean, I don't know how many times more that is than what Kansas has, but that aquatic habitat is part of our climate. The deep glacial soils we have in Minnesota are part of our climate and not part of the Kansas climate. So the way all these landscape features interact with the atmosphere is what provides our climate. So when we make these geographic analogies, if you know what I mean, and we just talk about temperature and precipitation, we're kind of ignoring all the landscape feedbacks and things
Some
like
of
that.
the structural parts of our
Right,
state.
so I think Minnesota's always going to be Minnesota, but Minnesota's going to change and evolve and become more of a hybrid in the future. And we don't exactly know what that's going to look like. We do know that the boreal forest region of the state, roughly 30% or so, mostly in the north and northeast, is going to continue to recede to the higher latitude, to the north.
Right now it's about a third of our state, isn't it?
Right, that's forested. Right. And then we're going to be populated, where we do have forests, we're going to be populated more by deciduous forests, you know, by the oaks and maples and other kinds of things.
Lose a lot of our coniferous trees. They're giving me the signal. I don't believe this could be possibly true, but I think it is. They want me to show our books, your books, because we're getting close to the end of our half hour here. So first of all, this is your most recent book.
That's right. That came out in 2015. It's a complete history of the state of Minnesota from a weather climate standpoint, starting with about 1804. Every significant weather and climate event in state history is documented in there, along with some narrative about the aftermath and things like that. Plus all the statistics for people that want to know, well, what's the average in Marshall, or what's the average in Brainerd?
It's broken down.
Yeah, you can look up all those numbers.
Yeah, I found it just really fun to peruse
thank you.
And learn, and so that was a fun one. And then a beautiful book that won some awards and came out, you thought, in about 2012.
That's
but
right.
It's still available.
That's a book I did with Don Brenneman, a wonderful photographer. Voyager Skies is Weather in the Wilderness in Minnesota's National Park. Those not familiar, that's the Crane Lake, Kabetogama, Namakan, and Rainy Lake, right along the Canadian border in Minnesota.
And our first national park.
Our first national park.
Right?
Wonderful, wonderful landscape. And I might add, a landscape that is being affected by climate change.
Is it?
And it's a wonderful, in fact, the national park was very, very happy with that book because it served as a good description. It was a good overall description of the landscape and the lakes of that national park.
Well, it's a beautiful book. If you want to look for a wonderful gift, it's just a gorgeous book.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. I want to have you answer those questions I threw out in the beginning.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't think we've answered any of them really. So the average number of tornadoes we have in Minnesota per year.
Well, I can't give you a precise number, but it varies as we bounce from one year to another. In modern times, it's between 35 and 40. I think the current number is around 36 or 37.
Okay. And the highest number I read was in 2010, 113.
113. In fact, we led the nation. We had more tornadoes than Oklahoma and Texas that
Did
year.
we? Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
What percentage of the state is forested? I think you just answered that.
About a third.
A third,
yeah,
right?
uh-huh.
And where are we nationally in ranking our wetlands?
Well, I'm not sure about the precise numbers, but I think the only state we trail is Alaska.
Yeah, that's
so we have a lot of wetlands in the state of Minnesota.
That was a surprise to me.
Right, right.
You mentioned how many lakes. I hadn't thrown that out, but that was a fun fact.
Right.
You know, we say the land of 10,000. Well, we've really got 11,842. And the heat index, the city that had the highest
Now this
heat
might
index.
surprise, this one is in the book, but it might surprise people. July 19th of 2011 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Moorhead, Minnesota in the Red River Valley, right across the Red from Fargo,
Right.
had a temperature of 97 degrees with a dew point of 88 degrees, and the calculated heat index was 134. There was a little bit of doubt that that was a real measurement, a real number, so that had to go through a lot of screening criteria by the National Weather Service, but that was later certified
Confirmed.
as tying Furnace Creek Death Valley for the highest heat index ever measured in the U.S.
Isn't
134. July 19th of 2011 in Moorhead, Minnesota.
That is a really interesting trivia question and fits into your earlier comment that we've got more range of dramatic weather here than almost anywhere.
Absolutely.
So,
People that remember last winter, for example, Mary, we got to 56 below up at good old Cook, Minnesota in St. Louis County.
did we? Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
I've repressed that number.
Yeah, maybe we like to block that out.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for coming down and
Thanks.
sharing all your ideas and wisdom. And
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to visit with you.
it went so fast. Thank you for joining us. I'll be back again next week. Maybe we can get Mark to come back sometime in the next year and give us some more thoughts about climate change. I want to pick his brain some more on that. So thanks for being with us. Have a good week.